afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Why Freedom Ain't Free, a Juneteenth event where we are talking today about the cost of liberation. We are so excited that you are joining us today, and we look forward to learning about liberation today from a perspective of Juneteenth, understanding the holiday and recognizing how amazing it is to celebrate freedom. Hello, we are the YWCA of Greater Cincinnati, and we have been useful in this space of the social services and supporting women and children in our area. We have been founded in 1868, and we have been carving out the space for social justice, providing the first Women's Employment Bureau in 1876, the first physical fitness classes for women in 1890, the first integrated cafeteria in the city in the 1950s, the first to train women in auto mechanics during World War II, anti-lynching campaigns, and so much more. YWCA Greater Cincinnati is on a mission to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. We are a champion of women and girls and all people suffering from oppression in three key ways: our direct service programming, our community outreach and education, and our advocacy through public policy support. In Swahili, we would say, Habari Gani, what's the news? And today's response is Juneteenth. Happy Juneteenth, everybody. We are talking about the holiday of liberation, why it came about, how it came about, and the liberation movements that are currently still in progress, and how we can move forward for true freedom. My name is Taylor Curtis, and I am your host today for this conversation. I am the Director of Racial Justice and Equity here at YWCA, and I hail from Dayton, Ohio originally, where I was the youngest Black female tenured in the history of the nation as a professor of psychology and Black studies. And I decided to take that passion for education and sharing awareness and building our community straight to the community, working with YWCA in the space of eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And I'm so excited about the robust panel that we have today. We have such amazing people who are going to bring a vibe, who are going to take us to another level of understanding and really unpacking how we can all be co-conspirators and part of the movement for liberation and part of that conversation of freedom. And so we have to do that. And in order for us to do that, we have to eliminate the structures that provide barriers for freedom. And we have to unpack what those look like and understand the cost that is associated with taking these steps towards liberation. So today we seek to answer those questions. What is freedom? What is the cost of freedom? And what does it take for us to truly be liberated? We have to come together in order for us to overcome the issues that we've experienced within our society and recognize how we can strategize to take steps forward. And that requires you, it requires me, it requires all of us as a part of community together. And one of the leaders of that space has been the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. We have seen the history. We have seen the opportunity to build upon that knowledge and to understand the things that have taken place in enslavement. And today we have with us Chris Miller. Chris Miller is the Senior Director of Education and Community Engagement with the National Underground Freedom Center, Underground Railroad Freedom Center, and we are very excited to have him with us today. He will be sharing with us a little bit about that history piece and understanding the background of enslavement and some of the things that have provided the barriers that we even see today. And so welcome to the stage, Chris Miller. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
So here we are today having this conversation. We're talking about Juneteenth, and I'm sure someone out there watching may not even know what Juneteenth is. As a matter of fact, we only recently have seen a national awareness about this holiday, and it has become a federal holiday only in the recent years. So tell us a little bit about the things that took place to lead us to this holiday that we call Juneteenth.
Well, I think it's important to understand that Juneteenth has been celebrated for several years. The state of Texas was the first state to acknowledge Juneteenth as a holiday. That was in 1980. Here in Cincinnati, Ohio, Juneteenth has been celebrated for more than 3 decades with the Cincinnati Juneteenth Festival. And so, celebrating Juneteenth is, although it may be new to some, it may be new to the national scope. This has been a tradition. This has been a practice for several years. And so, but I think it's very important. Why is it now a national holiday? I firmly believe that, the murder of George Floyd put things in motion for to incentivize areas of racial healing and understanding. And I believe making Juneteenth a national holiday is a part of that construct. And so it's unfortunate to say that, yes, we are celebrating Juneteenth and someone had to die. Someone was murdered in order for it to be elevated to this national scale, because there's been many people behind the scenes, scholars and historians that have been pushing for a national Juneteenth recognition. And so I think that is very, very important for us to have that understanding.
I think also it's very important to understand what, what is Juneteenth? What
Mhm.
is it? How do we define
Well,
it? What are we celebrating here?
the more common narrative that has been expressed is that, um, enslaved people in the state of Texas, specifically Galveston, Texas, were unaware of the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed them. And so it was on June 19th that General Gordon Granger rode into Galveston, Texas, bringing news of freedom in orders of General Orders number 3. It's very important to understand, to unpack that is a watered down, misleading narrative that has been part of the Juneteenth narrative. In fact, there was a war that was taking place between two nations. One called the United States of America, one called the Confederate States of America. When the Emancipation Proclamation was eventually signed on January 1st of 1863, the language in that document said it freed all those in the rebellious states, meaning those states that decided to secede from the United States. Keeping in mind that 7 of those Confederate states succeeded within the first 3 months of Abraham Lincoln's election. I will let that within 3 months of his election, they decided that they no longer wanted to be a part of the United States of America, create their own country with their own president and their own constitution. And so, with that, and then waged war against the United States. So, keep in mind that that proclamation was more of a political tool and maneuver to incentivize enslaved people within the Confederate States. Keeping in mind there were slave states that did not succeed from the Union and could still operate as a state. I look across the river every day at the Commonwealth of Kentucky, which did not succeed from the Union and could still operate as a slave state. It did not bring emancipation to the enslaved in that state until 6 months after Juneteenth.
That right there is rich history because people don't talk about the intricacies of what took place with enslavement and the process of ending enslavement. A lot of people don't realize the many different layers to what took place. It wasn't the compassion of hearts to say that treating individuals as property and animals and torturing and harming and the levels of violence are too much and that those are harsh and we need to revisit and we need to treat everyone as one. That was not the consensus. It was not Abraham Lincoln having a day of remorse and deciding that the enslaved people that he owned should indeed be free. As a matter of fact, he was not necessarily in favor of ending slavery, but more so in favor of ending this war. and building that political pool, right?
I think it's important to understand that, our history is not black and white, it's gray. And it's very important that we search critically for the truth, that we search critically for greater understanding. Abraham Lincoln was about preserving the Union. He did not want these states to succeed from the Union, and so therefore he was maneuvering how he can best. Um, to keep those states within the union. And so there were many things. He had a 10% plan, eventually, which the radical Republicans at the time thought it was too soft because the plan was 10% of the delegation from them states pledge allegiance to the United States and they could be readmitted. Well, the radical Republicans said no, 50%, at least 50% of their delegation. And so keeping in mind that, as I said, there's many layers. When we talk about enslavement and the spirit of enslavement, it comes in many forms. In 1857, you had the Dred Scott case,
Mhm.
and the Chief Justice at that time, Chief Taney, who is the first Roman Catholic to be appointed to that position, did not own slaves himself, said there are no rights that for a black man that a white man should respect or adhere to,
Mhm.
paraphrasing that. And so you have a situation to where there is this going onslaught of rights. And so when we talk about the general orders number 3, it talks about the absolute equality of personal rights. It also in those general orders makes a transformation from slaveholder, slave master, and slave to employer and employee. So now we're at a position to talk about labor. The black labor force was critical and essential to this country's economy. 60% of the world's cotton came out of those Confederate states. I repeat, 60% of the world's cotton. So not only did you have General Order number 3, but you also had General Orders number 4, which eradicated all Confederate governance. Because keep it in mind, the Confederacy was the enemy of the United States. So people that want to have flags, a Confederate flag next to American flag, that is that's you that is the most um outrageous thing to think of,
Yeah,
to have, because the Confederacy was an enemy of the United States. The other
yeah.
thing is there was General Orders number 5, and that addressed the cotton, about the cotton being turned in accordingly so that it could be processed. So understand the economics that was involved in enslavement.
Mhm.
And it's difficult for us to come to grips with it because our country was entrenched in treating human beings as chattel property to be
Yeah.
bought and sold. And so you talk about not only emancipation, but then you talk about equality. Then you talk about rights, being involved in political life. That's why many states that were not readmitted into the Union until years after Juneteenth. The state of Texas was not admitted back into the United States until 1870, 5 years after Juneteenth. There's much more to our history that we're just not aware of and are coming to grips about.
Absolutely. I want to thank you for that and thank you for sharing that information. I think it's so powerful to understand the many types of relationships that enslavement has with this country. That it is not just about economy, but that it is way beyond that. And really understanding that also helps us come to grips with how the laws have transitioned to today. We see now that the 13th Amendment that was ratified in 1865 after Juneteenth took place, that 13th Amendment was stating that we are no longer allowing slavery unless you have been convicted of a crime. And now, as we look at mass incarceration and the idea of new Jim Crow laws and understanding that this mass incarceration is impacting Black communities and Brown communities at much higher rates than any other community, where we're still seeing enslavement take place, we're still seeing that lack of equality and treatment, we're still seeing such a level of violence take place through this system, even if people maybe wrongfully convicted and put into these situations. We're seeing that level impact Black and brown people in another way as well. And so as we continue this conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like now and where we've come to through this process. So we thank you, Chris, for sharing that. And we're just going to pause for a moment and welcome Dr. Latisha Bates to the conversation. We thank you, Dr. Chris, for this wonderful part of the conversation, giving us that background. And Dr. Bates, we're going to invite Dr. Bates to bring us to today and walk us through some of the movements of liberation that we've seen taking place ever since these moments of recognizing that this needs to change and that freedom is necessary. And so Dr. Bates is an associate dean for inclusive excellence and community partnership at the University of Cincinnati. She's an associate professor of sociology. She's affiliated faculty in Black Studies, and she also is a part of our Racial Justice Committee at the YWCA, one of our board committees. And so we welcome Dr. Bates to the studio today. Welcome, Dr. Bates. We're glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Taylor Curtis, for having me. I am just super happy to be here with you all, and just so glad to be, following up behind Chris, because the information that he shared with us is so pivotal to us understanding how we might misunderstand movements as that relates to Black liberation.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about what these movements look like. Now, I know this is a loaded question, sis. Yeah. I am well aware that there have been numerous movements. I mean, we could look at the very first person to give life in the war and say that was the cost of liberation right there. Crispus Attucks, that Black man giving his life in a war that he didn't even really have place in, that had nothing to do with his freedom and liberation. We could certainly say, okay, we've seen different instances of liberation movement, but talk to us a little more about what liberation movement is and how we've seen that show up in this country.
Yeah. And so I think it's really interesting the way that you pose the question and the way that we generally think about social movements in the U.S., particularly as they relate to Black folks. And there are a couple of sort of highly publicized, if you will, pivotal social movements that we think about and that we talk about, right? And so we have the Civil Rights Movement, we have the Black Power Movement, now we have the Black Lives Matter movement. And we can sort of differentiate all of those movements from one another based on sort of what the central catalyst was that brought the movement into place, right? Even thinking about the Black Power movement in particular and how we came to use the term Black Power, right? So Richard Wright wrote a book in 1954 in which sort of we first see the term, right? But then Stokely Carmichael in 66 did a speech where it sort of popularized the term Black Power, right? We can think back to Marcus Garvey and his movement of Back to Africa. I think we can also think back to the enslaved people's revolts, right? Probably the most famous, thanks to modern cinema, is Nat Turner and that enslaved rebellion and revolt. And so what I would like for us to be thinking about as we're talking about liberation movements and Juneteenth is that while all these movements can be differentiated from one another, given the reason why they started, given the focus of the movement, right? Civil rights movement, giving us our civil rights, Black Lives Matter movement, coupling those civil rights with elevating the visibility of the murders of Black bodies. All of these movements are about liberation and they're tied to one another, right? And the movements that precede them give them their blueprint for how to organize. And then the blueprints are invigorated with innovation, right? And so marching isn't new, but being able to march and do it on social media in the way that we've been able to do it since the advent of social media is new, right? And so I think when we think about all of these movements, I might like for us to think about, instead of the sort of mainstay, if you will, of the movement, but to categorize them much broader, to think about them as liberation movements, right? The civil rights was trying to get us liberated to get our rights, sort of crassly speaking, right? It's much more nuanced than that, but thinking about the amount of time that we have. The Black Lives Movement was about elevating, visually the murders of Black bodies, but all of those things are about liberation of Black people. All of those things are about how to get Black people free. I think for me, the other important thing as a social justice warrior is understanding that liberation is about resistance. And that's how we get liberated, is through resistance, right? And so how resistance manifests in liberation, I'm able to demonstrate liberation, for me, is different. I am a very privileged, middle class, tenured professional, right? So what I can do to contribute to resistance and liberation varies from someone who might risk losing their job or might risk bankrupting their family. And so as we're thinking about liberation and what it means to be liberated, and what it has taken to get us to these liberation movements, as you nodded to in the beginning of this segment, everyone has given something different, right?
Yeah.
So what I want people to think about or take away as we're talking about liberation as a part of Juneteenth is figure out what your lane is as it relates to resistance and liberation, and then manifest that thing. If you can give your money to help liberate us, you should do that. If you can give your time to liberate us, you should do that, right? And so as we think about these movements, the common thread that pulls them all together is that they are about resistance and liberation for Black folks, which we know will lead to resistance and liberation for other folks in this country.
That's so huge and so important, because everybody has a responsibility. The world that you live in, the community that you live in, is directly impacted and indirectly impacted by racism, which is at the crux of what we're talking about when we're talking about liberation. We're talking about liberation from oppression, and racial oppression is one of the most, insidious ones that exist, because it is threaded through fire. It really is the fiber. It's threaded through every aspect of every system. And it then gives room for sexism and ableism and all of the other isms that exist. It then gives room to marginalize other communities. And so when we talk about, this liberation movement, it is an all hands on deck situation. It is one of those situations where everyone has a role to play. And like you said, how we play that role is going to vary from person to person, because you do have to consider the cost. I mean, one of the things that I've shared often with students when they, would come to me, I was still teaching at the time when 2020 happened, and the rise of the protests took place, and the peaceful protests were happening, and the riots were being instigated by white supremacist groups. And a lot of my students would come to me and say, hey, Miss Curtis, let's go. Like, let's go march. And my response was, you're not trained. You're not trained. You're not prepped. You're not educated. You're not aware. You don't know what the cost is going to be, and you're not prepared to count that cost. When we look at movements that you've mentioned, when we look at the Black Power movement, everyone was aware that they were battling, and that this was a life or death situation, and that they were going to be put into life or death situations. So, the Fred Hamptons that sacrificed their lives, that this was not a one-off, that they planned and were aware and knew that what they were doing was going to cost them. Martin Luther King knew that what he was doing was going to cost him, and he wasn't this beloved figure that everyone celebrates today. He was hated. The FBI did not support. Yeah, they didn't support these movements. The FBI of our country claimed that these movements were the biggest threat to the United States of America.
Call them terrorists. Call them terrorists, right?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to recognize that it is a cost associated, that you do give something up, whether it's your emotional labor, your spiritual energy, whether it is your physical time, talent, skills, knowledge, whether it's your money, your resources, your connections, your network, that there is a responsibility to all of us. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for illuminating what liberation really truly has looked at. And as we continue to talk about how liberation has looked, when we look at what that means for our area, for Cincinnati. I think about some of the concerns and some of the barriers then that we see, because obviously if we are fighting, that means that we are fighting something. If we are resisting something. And so I want to bring in Julie Sunderland, who is the program manager for the Cincinnati Regional Coalition Against Hate, a kindred spirit of mine and somebody who is on fire for change. And I want to welcome you, Julie, to the conversation. Thank you for being here.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me, Taylor, and for the Y being such a great member of the Coalition Against Hate, as well as the National Underground Freedom Center. Hi to Chris.
We wanted to bring you in, especially because you have this lens of recognizing when things happen in the city. And the Regional Coalition Against Hate has been about some of the response to what happens when we see hate pop up. And I want to talk about specifically some of the barriers that you've recognized over time that are barriers to liberation and freedom that we recognize here within our city.
Thanks. Yeah, well, that's great. So we are trying to be this representation, this helpful place, somewhere you can come, a trusted resource where you could report a hate crime, an incident, moments of bias. How can we help? How can we serve? And the truth is, we're not a trusted resource. There are barriers left and right over who is an accepted person. What are you going to do with the data? Can I trust you? Are there going to be fear of repercussions and consequences coming back to me? So from one of the most amazing people, Miss Tanisha Porter, we decided to start really listening and finding community experts and say, you're in my coalition, you're a member of a community. Last week we did the LGBTQ plus community. How can we come and listen? Tell us about what's going on in your community, what it would look like to you to feel supported, and how we can become a trusted resource, whether you need to apply to us anonymously or not. So we're going to do the 17 coalition members and then the 52 neighborhoods in Cincinnati. So we are looking for community experts to help do the work with us to find out what's really going on. I'm really inspired by everyone that's spoken, but Dr. Bates, finding your lane. What I thought I was going to talk about today is sort of the disproportionality in our public school systems in Cincinnati. And I'm not sure if everyone knows, I was not 100% aware. I work with children with disabilities and I work with just the Cincinnati public schools. And so finding out that our Cincinnati public schools, when you rate them out of what percentage they do to per 100 students, Black students are removed from schools 65 times out of 100, white students about 10. Ohio educators are 2 times more likely to identify Black students with intellectual disabilities, 2 times more likely to place Black students in restrictive areas, and 2 times more likely to remove them for discipline. They're 3 times more identified as emotional disturbance and expelled from school on a much more regular basis. So I was thinking about the barriers to liberation and the disproportionality that is taking place in the Cincinnati public schools, especially when you look at how do we, as a society, take care of our most vulnerable, right? So our students with disabilities, our Black students with disabilities are disproportionately being removed from services, removed from the classroom, removed from access, removed from all of those things. So I was thinking about one of the barriers that I deal with on a daily basis is the disproportionality that's happening, and the pipeline that leads right into your being in high school disproportionately expelled. 89% of the referrals to the police are from Black students, even though they're 63% of the population. So there's lots of things going on. And the Trump administration put a kibosh on this, but now it's back in effect. So disproportionality is going to be something that's studied from here moving forward. And significant areas of disproportionality, which we are one, will be receiving greater services.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think it's critical to recognize that not only does that take place in our school systems, but it is a parallel to what we see in almost every other system, this disproportionality that we see taking place in how people are punished, how people are treated, their socio-emotional responses, even believing the emotional responses, even as I think about our space where we hold space in domestic violence, hearing and listening and supporting and feeling heard, that is what's reported quite often as individuals or survivors, that if they have, the additional lens of identity being an ethnic minority or a Black person particularly, that there are additional levels of not being heard, not being listened to, not being provided the resources that are necessary. And we see this across the board. And quite honestly, we have to do something about it. And there are many people who are, but it takes the community recognizing the issue and people coming together to move the needle forward. One of the things that we've done, YWCA has taken our Peaceful Solutions program with restorative practices and provided training. And we've only provided some training to Cincinnati Public Schools, but we've been able to train everyone within Northwest School District, and being able to provide support on a regular basis to hold restorative practices and restorative circles to bring youth into conflict resolution and restoration and transformation of behavior rather than removing them from learning environments, which is detrimental to their completion rates as we look at the national rates of completion for students of color. And then we see that echoed when we start looking at college completion rates, especially for males of color. And then when we add in any type of intellectual disability or any type of additional mental health disorder or any other situation of physical disability, I mean, we can go down the list of having disproportionate experiences that are oftentimes leading to worse outcomes for those students. Not only worse outcomes for their educational experiences, career goals, opportunities, and things of that nature, but then the outcomes for the mental and physical health of dealing with being treated in a discriminatory way on a regular basis. That leads to chronic health issues, which is why racism has been declared a public health crisis, recognizing the mental and physical health impacts of discrimination, racial discrimination, and microaggression, and being marginalized on a regular basis, and saying that that leads to things like chronic depression, anxiety, PTSD. Also in Black mental health, we talk about misorientation, menticide. We talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome. And we talk about a lot of other issues that lead to suicidal ideation, isolation. And we see that having long-standing impacts in that intergenerational cycle and that intergenerational trauma. We also see levels of gastrointestinal problems, heart disease, high blood pressure, and a lot of diabetes and many other things that we see prevalent in Black societies as a direct response or result from racial experiences and the systems of racism that folks live in that contribute to those social determinants of health. And so as we think about that, education specifically, I also recognize that currently Ohio is facing several House bills that could completely upset the ability to have conversations about enslavement, conversations about why Juneteenth was necessary, conversations about systemic racism and the need for liberation and how to move that needle forward. Even conversations about socio-emotional learning are being considered divisive concepts with the House Bills 322, House Bills 327, and House Bill 616. And so we certainly recognize that these are threats to liberation education, and that there are many threats to that within our society, and we all must come together to make an impact in how we navigate these issues within our society. So thank you again for sharing, Julie, and sharing about what the Cincinnati Regional Coalition Against Hate is doing. And I want to put a plug out there that if those of you watching want to be engaged, want to be involved in changing the community, please feel free to reach out, feel free to join, because we would like to see more of the community represented and attending these listening sessions. YWCA will actually be hosting the ACLU sponsored community listening session on July 5th on Zoom. It's virtual, so feel free to check out our website, and it will be on our calendar July 5th that evening. We will be hosting a community listening session then as well, to just add on to these conversations about what the community needs, what resources we need, and the issues that we're experiencing within the community. So at this time, I want to invite all of our panelists to join back to the screen and have a little bit more conversation. And we're joined by the amazing and incredible Ray Ball. Ray Ball is the founder of Ball R Media. She is the co-founder of Palooza Noir and is currently stationed at the Palooza Noir Juneteenth Block Party, which I will be joining later.
Reporting live.
And so she's reporting live from the Juneteenth Block Party. So hopefully those of you who have not yet solidified your plans, or if you have solidified, change them up and go down to the banks to the Juneteenth Block Party with Palooza Noir from 4 to 11 this evening. And we'll share more about other opportunities coming up for you to celebrate Juneteenth in community. But we're also joined by Shaunak Sastry, the director of the Cincinnati Project, associate professor of communication at the University of Cincinnati. And again, our panelists who have already spoken today, we have again Chris Miller from the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, Dr. Latisha Bates from the University of Cincinnati, and Julie Sunderland from Cincinnati Regional Coalition Against Hate. And I want to open up this conversation to all of us and just talk a little bit about the difference between equity, justice, and liberation. You know, these buzzwords are out here and people are talking about all of these things that we should be doing to treat each other with respect and responsibility and hold accountability in our community. But I think it's important that we start to unpack what is the difference. So anybody want to share your first thoughts about the difference between equity, justice, and liberation?
I guess I'll go. I'll go first. I think it's so. What's interesting is that historically the thought has been for emancipation, but that's also assuming that with emancipation, equality would come. And so what we have had are decades of inequality taking place. Although we're celebrating Juneteenth and we're talking about the process and this being a part of freedom, but what has happened along the way is just resistance towards equality. When we talk about the equality to participate in political life, whether that be through voting or even running for office and winning elections and things of that nature. And so there's always been these barriers that is taking place. And so when you have this generation after generation, and when you have this over decades, now we're in a place where we need to talk about equity. And that is to make up for all these decades and generations of unequal circumstances and social conditions. And so we have to be talking about terms about equitable measures, taking into account of the history and past that has taken place. And so that is definitely a difference on that scale. And I'll leave it up to my outstanding cast to move that forward as well.
Can I say something, Taylor, real quick? So first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm very honored to be here, and I've been listening very intently, I assure you, for the last half an hour. And so I'm going to start off with the prompt that Dr. Bates gave us about staying in our lane in responding to sort of your query, right? So I direct a center called the Cincinnati Project, and we conduct community-based research, and mostly that research is aimed at reducing or addressing the disproportionate effects of racism in health, right, in the Cincinnati area. And so I'm a health disparity scholar. So I think about your question about the relationship between equity and liberation in the context of health, right? We can think of health equity. You know, everybody wants to be a health equity champion now because it's a buzzword, it's fundable, right? It's there, it's present. But it's also linked in very fundamental ways to the idea of basic dignity, right? What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to have to sort of pursue liberation if it is not grounded in the everyday struggles for health, right? To be able to access care, to be given dignity when our bodies are non-compliant with us, right? To be afforded respect at the hospitals, in our communities. And so when I think about this, the relationship between equity and health, I think of it as a health scholar as being able to tell stories about the lack of equity, right, and how that challenges um, a vision of being sort of our best liberated self, right? So, for example, recently I've been working with an organization called the Cancer Justice Network, and one of the things that we have tried to do is address the rampant disparities in COVID vaccine distribution, right? And so part of the challenge here for us has been to also tackle this sort of racialized understanding of attitudes towards the vaccine, right? So when, for example, when someone is poor and refuses to or is unable to access healthcare in the context of, say, COVID, right? We often apply these labels, these stereotypes that we have in our head as to why or what motivates this person not to act, right? But in many cases, rather than thinking about this ideologically, we've found at the Cincinnati project, looking at problems through the questions of access, through dignity, like how, what is it going to cost you to go get a vaccine if your fundamental dignity is going to be threatened, right? And so when you pose that question, it makes a lot of sense from a sort of very counterintuitive point of view to say, no, I don't want my dignity to be erased at an everyday healthcare interaction. So to sort of tie back to your original question, I see those concepts as related, but I see them as grounded in sort of the everyday enactments and struggles for health.
Kind of to piggyback off of everyone, it kind of seems like a very central piece of this is access, whether it's access to information, whether, just like we saw in Juneteenth, how there was a lack of access to communication, there's a lack of access to the correct information. And we still see this, even if you piggyback off of the COVID vaccine issues that we're having in a lot of our communities, is there's a lack of trust, but the access to the right information to get it to the right people at the right time. I think that it expands everywhere, even from a liberation or a freedom perspective. And I said, in my experience, liberation, to be liberated, you had to be somewhere where you had a lack of freedom. So to be liberated, you have access to freedom now. So who is an ally? Who is a gatekeeper? How can we create more keys? So that we can have more access again to proper healthcare, to the right communication, to the right political offices in our local communities, to get local politicians, give them the access to the people that they're serving, to understand what they're going through, their struggles, access even to political organizations, access to cultural competency training. I think a lot of it does come back to access, even for able-bodied and maybe disabled-bodied individuals. How are they going to seek freedom? How are they going to get free from the walls of their apartment? How are they going to get freedom to go to a grocery store and to get food that they need? I think for me, I think very, very, very big picture. But I mean, when you think of freedom, we also have to bring it down to a very, very, very personal level. Do we know how to be free in our own lives? Do I feel free when I wake up in the morning? Do I feel liberated from bills? Do I feel liberated from injustice? Do I feel liberated from implicit bias? And I think that a lot of our community does not feel free from the normal everyday nuances. So to think, how can I free the whole when the one hasn't necessarily figured out what that looks like for them? So I think to a certain extent, to have that liberation, to have that freedom, to have that equity, we also have to start to look inside of ourselves so that we can, again, affect that whole from, again, a more holistic perspective, because we've seen politics, it's not always our best friend. We've seen justice reform is not our best friend. We've seen, the things and policies that are put into place that were supposed to help us and create equity and create freedom and to liberate us from all of these things, but they were put in place by the same people who put all of those barriers in place. So are we ever really free?
That is the question, sis. And I hear that, and that resonates so much with me. And it leads me to ask, then, what can you all suggest to those who are watching as steps that we can take as individuals to be co-conspirators of liberation, because as my sister Ray just put it, we see so many layers of oppression in areas that are intersecting for each individual. And there's so many areas that we could talk about where we need to eliminate some type of barrier. And so that means that those of us who are able-bodied then are co-conspirators to those who are not, to make sure that when you set up the luncheon in the room, that there is space for someone with the wheelchair to have access to all the things they need access to and not feel othered in that process. For those who have money, it is then your responsibility to think about those who do not, and to be cautious and use that privilege in helping and leveraging that to help someone else. It is our responsibility to be co-conspirators of liberation. So what are steps that an individual could take to do that?
I'll start us off here. It's really funny. I feel like sometimes I'm a broken record, that I'm just on a loop saying the same thing over and over again, but I really believe it. I believe it's about our lanes, right? And so I don't believe that it's a one size fit all. And so as we think about what it means to be free, how we get to freedom, how we get to liberation, what can I do? It is a very introspective thing that has to happen first, right? Because first you have to be aware of what it is, as my sister Ray just said, that you are trying to get free from. Because what you are trying to get free from might differ in some instances, right? Again, we're talking about systematic oppression and systematic racism, generally speaking, but how that impacts me on a daily basis as a Black woman may vary greatly from how it impacts Shaunik, right? As a man who was born in India, for example. And so how we think about the steps that we need to take will vary from person to person. But the end goal has to be shared. And it has to be liberation from systematic oppression. If that is your end goal, I don't care how you get there, as long as you get there. I might ride a bike, you might walk, you might run, but we're all going in the same direction. And so maybe I don't know how to ride a bike, so I can't get to freedom by bike riding because I don't know how to ride a bike, but I'm a runner, so I'm going to run. And so what I would like for people to take away and to always keep in the forefront of their mind is that I am doing something to meet the end of toppling systematic oppression and racism, that I am participating in the activity of eradicating racism, that I am participating in some shape or form in ensuring that the generations that come after me won't have these same experiences. As a parent, I do that through my children. I teach them how to enact resistance in their schools, and how to show up every day as a co-conspirator, right? And so that is one of the ways in which I practice freedom and liberation. I free my children so that they can go and free their classmates and participate in that way. And so I think it varies, and we get so caught up in trying to do liberation and freedom like somebody else that we worry that we're not doing enough. Are you doing anything to move us towards toppling systematic oppression? If so, I can ride with you.
That is it. That is the ticket. All right, I want to open it up. Anybody else want to share thoughts about how to take steps as an individual to be a co-conspirator of liberation?
I would speak. Education is so important, and speaking the authentic truth within the education system is under attack. And so we need people to be advocates of the authentic truth, making sure that they're being vigilant about House bills that will drastically impact the authentic truth being taught in our K through 12 schools, being taught at our universities, being taught at museums, being taught at our educational institutions. The authentic truth is under attack right now. And so we need advocates that are committed to seeking out the truth, making sure it is educated, because For those in the in the worship house, in the faith, it's always said, "Is the truth that shall set us free." And so, if the truth is being denied in all these areas and sectors of our communities, then how can we move towards freedom if it's the truth is being denied? So, we need people to be about the business of understanding these laws and policies that are trying to hinder and eradicate the truth.
I guess maybe
Absolutely.
it actually, can I take it back onto that real quick? So one maybe does actually come always back instead of access to knowing your lane. And when it comes to like knowing the truth, I think something that was highlighted during, I say, the last 3 years, that we've seen a lot of this racial injustice, is understanding and supporting what I kind of consider generational freedom fighters. Just like you said, your students who they want to march today and they have no idea that they probably need a lawyer to call. They have no idea that their scholarship could be in jeopardy by getting arrested for going to a march. They don't know any of these things, right? So we kind of also start have to meet these generations where they are. But one of the things I say that I used to love social media. It's media. It is very social. I'll say that. But I would say the young activists, the generational freedom fighters, specifically in the creative lanes, I will say that they have done an amazing job at trying to portray our message, through photography, through video, through art, through clothing. And it's something that I know, my grandparents, they weren't freedom fighting through social media. They weren't using photos. It wasn't through a lens that could immediately go to thousands of people, right? So now we're able to wear a shirt that says "Stop Killing Black People." We're allowed to support brands like Black Owned, which is a local Cincinnati brand. We're able to do these things. But I'll say definitely from a generational perspective, I don't want to call them kids, because they're not kids, they're young adults, but they're definitely, I'd say, creating their own lane. And it's going to be very, very, very important for generations before them to be very supportive and receptive of how they're choosing to fight for freedom. Because it is much different than, my grandparents and my parents.
Absolutely. That is so true and so real. The fight is different. It looks different. It feels different. It's set up different. And what you're fighting looks different. It feels different. It is set up different. It is not as blatant, although sometimes it is. It is not characterized in the same ways that we've seen it over and over again. And so we do have to learn new ways to fight. And so with us learning that, it requires us to educate yourself, as you've all mentioned, that you have to learn and educate yourself, not only in what are you fighting, but in the lane that you decide is best for you to fight, really knowing how to be strategic in that lane and how to be in that lane and use that lane. So I want to encourage you that we still have our Stand Against Racism Challenge available on our website. You can go to our website and join the Stand Against Racism Challenge. It's also in the comments. You can find the link there. It is a space where you can learn a lot about the issues at hand and how it shows up. And using that 21 days of challenging yourself to unpack those resources and learn more can be useful as a tool to have those conversations with your circle, have those conversations with your family, with your coworkers, with the groups that you belong to within community, with your church house and all the other spaces that you occupy, that you can educate yourself and then use that education to have conversations with others. You can tell your legislators how you feel and talk about how important it is to say no to those House bills that Chris was talking about, and helping others to unpack why my vote matters, and recognizing that it does matter, that we are looking at redistricting in Ohio right now because we recognize how important votes are, and who you vote for matters not only locally, but also at the state level and the federal level, and that who you vote for locally influences the policy that takes place right here in your own hometown. And so recognizing that you have the power to influence policy here at home, and that you have the power and the collective power no, it doesn't all work the same. Yes, you can call a senator and say, I got a voicemail. Yes, you can write a letter and say, I didn't receive anything back. But if 100 of us call on the same day, something will shake, something will move. And so recognizing that power does exist, how do you catalyze that power is the thing that you have to figure out for the lane that you belong to. I want to also mention that there are other things that you could do to get more involved, and that is to get involved in your community. So I want to give a hot second over to Ray so she can tell you about a way to get involved in the community today with the Juneteenth Block Party, and then I'll share a little bit about tomorrow and pass it to Chris as well.
Yeah, so quick background. This is our third year doing Juneteenth. It's our second year doing it at the banks. We have really been very intentional, I'd say, this year about, the different organizations that we work with, the different programming that we'll be having. So it is honestly a family-friendly event from 4 to 11 at the banks. We will have DJs. We'll have the cute kids, which is actually my most favorite group. But it's being very intentional about, again, finding organizations like the cute kids to be able to perform on platforms like this. Being very intentional about finding young African American female DJs and incorporating them into our lineup. Making sure that our corporate partners are very, very, very specific in understanding that this is a Juneteenth holiday. So your employees, we really don't want them working today. We don't want that. These are small things that we're trying to incorporate into the community. But essentially, we'll have a food truck alley. We'll have fire trucks. We'll have a few different of our partners. Fifth Third Bank is our title sponsor, Procter and Gamble. They'll have some trailers for career and job readiness, and for we know these are really amazing companies, but we also want them to be accessible to the groups of people that they want talent with. So again, I welcome everyone out. It is a free event from 4 to 11 at the banks. That was really long-winded.
It's fine, and details are in the comment section, so feel free to check out the website in the comment section. Tomorrow is the 35th annual Juneteenth Festival at Eden Park from 12 to 9. YWCA will be out there along with the MLK Coalition, and we have some wonderful opportunities for you to get more information about our services, especially our training and consultation. We do train in the areas of social justice and provide training and consultation, especially around things like implicit bias and creating an equitable organization and understanding cultural competency. So feel free to come hang out with us or learn more on our website. In the comment section has the Juneteenth 35th Annual Festival information as well. And then Chris, you want to share about your event?
Absolutely. I encourage those that hear the sound of my voice to attend the Black Party, the festival, be engaged with everything that's going on. Also, come here, visit us here at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. Our museum hours are from 10 to 5. Tomorrow, Saturday, we will have our teen docent and scholarship contest award ceremony at 2 p.m. in the Harriet Tubman Theater. Later that night, we will have Juneteenth evening at the museum with 3 local poets and spoken word artists, Will Roberts, Gerard Lindsay, and Siri Yamani will be there to feature their artwork. We have Chasing the Dream, which are 3 musicians that will be accompanying them. You'll be able to go to our exhibit, see the Marking Time exhibit as well. And then if you can't attend this on Saturday, on Sunday, with the generosity of Fifth Third, we have our community free days. We're from 10 to 5 on Sunday, where you can come down. We will have activities. We will have art stations. I will be doing a gallery talk at about 12:30. And so can visit us Saturday and Sunday. Please know that we are a resource, not only for the community, we are a resource for the city and for the nation, and we would love for you to join us.
Thank you so much. And then also on Monday will be the Juneteenth Parade. So if you check out our comment section, there are tons of links to all of the festivities happening this weekend. We hope that you take a step and figuring out what your lane is, recognizing that you are a part of the co-conspirator movement to liberation, that we can come together as a community, and that through our work and our efforts together, we can all make steps towards change. Again, YWCA, thanks you for joining us for Why Freedom Ain't Free, a Juneteenth event, and we hope to see you at the Juneteenth festivities over the weekend. You all have a wonderful weekend, and again, remember that it is not much, but a step a day to make change towards eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. I'm your host, Taylor Curtis. We thank you again for joining us. Have a wonderful day.